The world only calls someone weak until that person becomes the reason hope survives. Emily Carter had heard those words only once, whispered by her grandmother on a winter night long before the old woman disappeared beneath the endless snowstorms that haunted Frost Vale. No one else in the village believed them. Certainly not the warriors gathering beneath the towering pine trees that morning, fastening polished leather armor across broad shoulders while boasting about the annual winter boundary patrol. Frostvale Pack lived where the mountains scraped the clouds, where frozen rivers cut through forests older than memory, and where every child learned that survival belonged to the strongest wolves. Emily had never belonged among them. At 20 years old, she remained what the others politely called a gentle omega, and what the crueler voices simply called a burden. She possessed no legendary strength, no fearsome wolf capable of defending the pack, no commanding scent that turned heads whenever she entered a room. Even her wolf remained strangely quiet, more like a distant heartbeat than the roaring spirit every alpha proudly carried. While young warriors trained with spears and practiced shifting beneath the pale winter sun, Emily spent her mornings wrapping injured paws, cleaning cuts on frightened sled dogs, and nursing abandoned forest creatures back to health inside a tiny wooden shelter near the edge of the woods. Most wolves dismissed her work as pointless. Animals were replaceable. Warriors were not. Kindness, they often reminded her, had never won a battle. A burst of laughter echoed across the frozen clearing as a group of young alphas loaded supplies onto heavy sleds. One of them glanced toward Emily, who knelt beside a snow-white fox carefully removing a thorn from its paw. "Still playing nurse?" he called with a grin. "If danger ever comes to Frostvale, are you planning to scare it away with bandages?" The others laughed, their voices rolling across the snow like cold wind. Emily simply smiled without looking up. The little fox trembled beneath her fingertips until she softly stroked its neck, and almost immediately its breathing slowed. She had never understood why frightened creatures trusted her so quickly. Birds landed beside her without fear. Injured wolves stopped growling the moment she whispered to them. Even wild elk seemed calmer whenever she approached. It was the only gift she possessed, and according to nearly everyone in Frostvale, it was the least useful one imaginable. The village bell suddenly rang 3 sharp times. Every conversation stopped. The deep bronze sound spread through the valley with unusual urgency. Hunters turned. Elders emerged from their homes. Even the restless horses lifted their heads toward the northern peaks. Moments later, a royal messenger burst into the square atop a frost-covered horse, its sides heaving from exhaustion after what had clearly been a brutal ride through the mountains. Snow clung to the messenger's dark cloak embroidered with the silver crest of the Northern Kingdom. His face had gone pale beneath the freezing wind. "Hear this by order of the crown," he shouted, struggling to catch his breath. "The Alpha King's great wolf has vanished beyond the Icefang Ridge." Silence settled over Frostvale. No one moved. No one even seemed to breathe. Every child had grown up hearing stories about the great wolf, a magnificent white guardian said to be older than kingdoms themselves, a creature whose loyalty to Alpha King Adrian Blackthorn had become legend across the north. Some claimed its howl could shake glaciers. Others believed it had never once been defeated. The messenger swallowed hard before speaking again. "Search parties have found signs of a collapse near Black Hollow Ravine." A murmur swept through the crowd like a rising storm. Emily's heart tightened for reasons she could not explain. She had never seen the great wolf. She knew nothing beyond the old stories. Yet somewhere beneath the frozen silence surrounding the village, she felt something else. Not heard. Not imagined. Felt. A faint distant ache. Like a lonely heartbeat calling through miles of snow and ice. Emily stood perfectly still while the voices around her dissolved into anxious whispers. The royal messenger continued answering questions from the elders, but she heard almost none of them. That strange ache remained, faint yet unmistakable, pulsing somewhere beyond the endless walls of ice that surrounded Frostvale. It was not fear. It was not curiosity. It felt like someone far away was silently asking for help. She pressed one hand against her chest, hoping the feeling would disappear, yet it only grew stronger. Elder Marcus stepped toward the gathered hunters with a stern expression. "No one crosses Icefang Ridge without royal command," he declared. "Black Hollow Ravine has taken experienced warriors before. The mountain does not forgive mistakes." The crowd nodded in agreement. Every child in Frostvale knew the stories. Black Hollow Ravine was a wound carved into the mountain itself, hidden beneath drifting snow and jagged cliffs. Travelers who wandered too close often returned with tales of cracking ice, blinding storms, and strange echoes that seemed almost alive. Many never returned at all. The royal messenger lowered his head. The king has already sent his finest trackers, but another storm is moving across the northern pass. Every hour matters. Emily noticed the exhaustion in his eyes. Whatever had happened beyond the ridge was worse than anyone wished to admit. The hunters quickly began discussing routes and supplies, each determined to prove worthy of joining the royal search. None of them noticed the small gray owl fluttering weakly onto a nearby fence. One wing drooped awkwardly, and its frightened amber eyes searched the crowded square until they settled on Emily. Without thinking, she walked toward it. The owl did not flee. Instead, it allowed her gentle hands to lift it from the cold wood. "Poor little one," she whispered. "You flew too hard in the storm." She carefully examined its injured wing, while the conversations behind her continued to grow louder. "Emily." The quiet voice belonged to Clara, the village baker, who had watched her since childhood with more kindness than most. "You should stay away from all this. The mountain is no place for someone like you." Emily smiled softly. "I know." But even as she answered, the distant ache returned with surprising force. For just an instant her vision blurred. Snow. Wind. White fur stained with frost. A pair of brilliant silver eyes closing in exhaustion. The images vanished almost as quickly as they appeared. Emily blinked several times, wondering if the cold had finally begun playing tricks on her mind. She had experienced unusual feelings before whenever an animal was suffering nearby, but never like this. Never across such impossible distance. She gently wrapped the owl's wing with a narrow strip of clean cloth from her satchel. The bird blinked once, then settled calmly against her arm as though it had known her forever. "You always find the broken ones," Clara said with a warm smile. Emily looked toward the towering mountains beyond the village. Their peaks had already disappeared behind dark gray clouds gathering with alarming speed. The wind carried tiny crystals of ice through the air, stinging every exposed face. Somewhere beyond those frozen cliffs, whatever she had sensed was fading. She could feel it slipping farther away, like a heartbeat growing weaker beneath layers of snow. Then another sound drifted across the valley. It was almost too distant to hear, carried between gusts of icy wind. It was not the howl of an ordinary wolf. It was deeper, older, filled with quiet strength that now trembled beneath unbearable exhaustion. Every hair along Emily's arm stood on end. No one else in the square reacted. The hunters continued preparing their gear. The messenger spoke with the elders. The villagers hurried indoors before the storm arrived. Emily slowly lifted her eyes toward Icefang Ridge. Somewhere beyond those white mountains, a lonely soul was still waiting, and for reasons she could not explain, it felt as though it was calling only to her. Emily barely remembered walking home. Her feet carried her through familiar snow-covered paths while her thoughts remained somewhere beyond Icefang Ridge. Following that fading heartbeat only she seemed able to feel. The little gray owl rested quietly inside the shelter beside the other recovering animals, but even its peaceful breathing could not calm the growing unease in her chest. Outside, the wind strengthened until it rattled every wooden shutter in Frostvale. Winter storms always arrived with little warning, yet this one felt different. The air itself seemed restless. As evening settled over the valley, Emily lit a small oil lamp and placed another log onto the fire. She tried to focus on simple tasks, filling water bowls, checking fresh bandages, and preparing warm broth, but every few minutes she found herself staring toward the dark outline of the northern mountains through the frosted window. The feeling returned again, stronger than before. This time it came with another brief vision. Endless white cliffs. A massive paw slipping across shattered ice. A pair of silver eyes refusing to close despite overwhelming exhaustion. Emily caught her breath and steadied herself against the table. "Who are you?" she whispered into the quiet room. There was no answer, only the crackling fire and the distant roar of the storm. A soft knock sounded at her door. Clara stepped inside carrying a basket covered with thick cloth. "I thought you should not spend the night alone," she said with a gentle smile. "The whole village is talking about the king's search parties." Emily accepted the fresh bread with grateful hands. Has anyone found the great wolf? Clara slowly shook her head. No. Some of the royal trackers returned before sunset because the mountain became too dangerous. They say fresh snow covered nearly every trail. Emily lowered her eyes. Something inside her quietly refused to believe the search had truly ended. Clara studied her for a long moment. You have that look again. Emily blinked. What look? The same one you had when you found that injured fawn during the blizzard last year. You always seem to know when something needs you. Emily forced a small smile, but it faded almost immediately. What if I am wrong? Clara gently squeezed her shoulder. Your heart has never led you toward cruelty. After Clara left, silence settled over the little cabin once more. Emily stood before the window while snow swept across the valley in endless silver waves. The ache inside her chest had become impossible to ignore. It no longer felt distant. It felt urgent. She closed her eyes and listened. Beneath the howl of the wind, beneath the creaking trees, beneath every ordinary sound of winter, there it was again. A slow heartbeat. Weak. Steady. Waiting. When she opened her eyes, her decision had already been made. Before dawn, she quietly packed a small satchel with clean cloth, dried herbs, rope nearly 50 feet long, a lantern, flint, and enough food for 2 days. None of it resembled the equipment carried by seasoned hunters. She owned no sword, no spear, and no heavy armor. She only packed the things she always carried whenever she believed a life could still be saved. As the first pale light touched the eastern sky, Emily stepped outside. Frostvale remained asleep beneath fresh snow, unaware that one quiet Omega was walking toward the most feared mountain in the north. The cold wind pushed against her as though warning her to turn back, but she continued climbing the narrow trail leading toward Icefang Ridge. Somewhere beyond the frozen cliffs, the lonely heartbeat answered hers once again, softer now than ever before, and Emily realized with quiet certainty that if she waited for someone stronger to arrive, she might already be too late. The climb grew steeper with every passing mile until even the familiar pines of Frostvale disappeared behind walls of ancient stone and drifting snow. Emily pulled her heavy wool cloak tighter around her shoulders as icy wind swept across the mountainside with enough force to steal her breath. Each careful step sank several inches into fresh powder, leaving the only trail visible across the untouched white landscape. She had never traveled this far north alone, yet the strange connection inside her chest continued guiding her with quiet certainty. It was no longer simply a feeling. It had become a rhythm, a slow heartbeat, fading, waiting. She rounded a cluster of towering ice-covered boulders and suddenly stopped. Before her stretched black hollow ravine. The stories had never captured its true scale. The earth simply disappeared into an endless canyon swallowed by mist and shadow. Massive walls of blue ice rose on either side, glistening beneath the pale winter sun like frozen glass. Gusts of wind spiraled upward from the unseen depths. Below, carrying tiny crystals that shimmered through the air before vanishing into silence. Emily carefully approached the edge and looked down. The bottom could not be seen. The ravine seemed to fall forever into darkness. Her heart pounded as another pulse echoed inside her mind. Stronger now. Closer than ever. She slowly followed the sound with her eyes until something white caught her attention far below, partially hidden beneath a narrow shelf of fractured ice. At first she believed it was another snowdrift. Then it moved. Barely. Emily fell to her knees. Resting on the frozen ledge lay the largest wolf she had ever imagined. Even from such impossible distance, its thick white fur reflected the winter light like polished silver. One enormous foreleg remained trapped beneath a collapsed sheet of ice while its chest rose only with slow, exhausted breaths. The majestic creature lifted its head for a brief moment as though sensing her presence, and its brilliant silver eyes met hers across the vast emptiness between them. Every vision she had experienced suddenly became real. Every heartbeat she had followed belonged to this lonely guardian. Emily searched the cliffs for another path but found only sheer walls and unstable ice. There was no safe trail leading down. No bridge. No hidden staircase. Only the rope coiled inside her satchel. She quietly measured its length with trembling hands. It would barely reach the narrow ledge. She secured one end around the thick roots of a weathered pine growing near the cliff's edge, testing every knot twice before pulling with all her strength. The old tree held firm against the frozen ground. Emily closed her eyes for one long breath. Every lesson she had learned since childhood told her to turn back. Find the royal search party. Bring stronger people. Return with proper equipment. Yet every instinct whispered the same truth. There was no time left. The great wolf's breathing had grown even weaker during the few moments she had stood watching. She wrapped the rope around her waist, adjusted the lantern against her side, and carefully lowered herself over the edge. The freezing stone pressed against her boots while tiny pieces of ice crumbled away beneath each cautious step. The wind roared through the canyon, causing the rope to sway gently above the endless darkness below. Emily refused to look down again. She focused only on the white figure waiting beneath her. Halfway to the ledge, a sharp cracking sound echoed across the ravine. A section of ice broke loose from the cliff above, falling harmlessly into the mist far below, but the vibration shook the rope enough to make Emily cling tightly against the frozen wall. Her heartbeat raced, yet she did not climb back. She slowly continued downward until she was close enough to see the great wolf clearly. Its powerful body remained perfectly still except for the faint rise and fall of each tired breath. As Emily reached out with one gloved hand, the magnificent creature opened its silver eyes once more, and instead of fear, she found quiet trust waiting within them. Emily's boots finally touched the narrow shelf of ice, and for a brief moment she simply remained still, allowing the rope above to stop swaying. The frozen ledge was barely wide enough for two people to stand side by side, and every breath she released drifted into the cold air like pale mist. The magnificent wolf lay only a few feet away. Up close, it was even more extraordinary than the old stories had described. Its thick white coat shimmered with tiny crystals of frost, each strand catching the winter light as though woven from silver threads. Even while exhausted, the creature carried a quiet dignity that no hardship could erase. Emily slowly removed one glove before extending her hand. "It is all right," she whispered, her voice almost disappearing beneath the wind. "I am not here to hurt you." The great wolf watched her without moving. Those remarkable silver eyes seemed older than the mountains themselves, filled with wisdom instead of fear. Emily noticed the heavy slab of cracked ice resting across its powerful foreleg. She carefully knelt beside it, keeping every movement calm and deliberate. "This might be uncomfortable," she said softly, "but I think we can do this together." The wolf gave the faintest nod of its great head, almost as though it understood every word. Emily examined the trapped leg as gently as she could. The ice had pinned it firmly, but the weight appeared uneven. If she could shift just one side, the pressure might release without causing the rest of the ledge to collapse. She searched her satchel and removed a short wooden handle she normally used to support injured tree branches while making splints. It was hardly a proper tool for moving ice, but it was all she had. She wedged it beneath the cracked edge and leaned with steady pressure. Nothing happened. She tried again, placing all of her weight behind the effort. The frozen slab shifted only an inch before settling once more. Emily paused to catch her breath. "One more time," she murmured, though she could not tell whether she was encouraging the wolf or herself. As she pushed again, the great wolf gathered what little strength remained and carefully lifted its shoulder. Together, their efforts finally loosened the fractured ice enough for it to slide harmlessly aside across the ledge. The enormous paw slipped free. Emily smiled with quiet relief. "There you are." She immediately began checking the injured leg with gentle fingertips. She found no broken bone, only swelling from being trapped too long beneath the frozen weight. She opened her satchel, mixed crushed mountain herbs with clean snow inside a small cloth, and carefully wrapped the cooling bundle around the injured leg before securing it with fresh bandages. The wolf remained perfectly still throughout the process, watching her with calm patience. As Emily rested one bare hand against its warm white fur to steady the final knot, something unexpected happened. A gentle warmth spread through her fingertips, flowing upward into her arm like sunlight breaking through winter clouds. The great wolf released a long, peaceful breath, and the frantic rhythm she had sensed all day began to slow into something steady and calm. Emily froze. She had never experienced anything like this before. She had soothed frightened animals countless times, but this felt deeper, as though invisible threads connected their heartbeats for a single quiet moment. Tiny silver lights shimmered across the wolf's thick coat before fading into the surrounding snow. The wind, which had roared through the ravine without pause, suddenly softened until only silence remained. Emily blinked, wondering if exhaustion had caused her imagination to wander. Yet when she looked into the great wolf's eyes again, they seemed brighter than before, carrying renewed strength where only weariness had existed moments earlier. The magnificent creature slowly lowered its great head until it gently rested against her shoulder in silent gratitude. Emily smiled through tears she had not realized were forming. "You are going to be all right," she whispered. High above them, hidden beyond the edge of the ravine, fresh hoofbeats echoed faintly across the frozen mountain, growing closer with every passing second. The sound of approaching horses grew louder until it echoed across every wall of the frozen ravine. Emily looked up instinctively, shielding her eyes from the drifting snow. Shadows moved along the cliff high above, followed by calm but urgent voices calling to one another through the mountain wind. The royal search party had finally arrived. Relief washed over her. She had not realized how desperately she had hoped someone else would come before the climb back became necessary. Beside her, the great wolf slowly lifted its massive head. Its breathing had become noticeably steadier, and although it still favored its injured foreleg, the quiet strength in its posture had returned. Emily smiled. "They found you," she whispered. "You are finally going home." Instead of looking toward the voices above, the great wolf continued watching her with those remarkable silver eyes. There was something almost thoughtful in its gaze, as though it wished to memorize her face. Emily gently rested one hand against the soft white fur. "You do not have to worry anymore." A deep, peaceful rumble vibrated softly within the wolf's chest. It was not a warning. It sounded more like gratitude. Above the ravine, a commanding voice carried clearly through the icy air. "Secure every anchor. Search every ledge. Do not leave until he is found." The words were calm, steady, and filled with quiet authority. That silenced every other voice immediately. Emily had never heard that voice before, yet somehow she knew who it belonged to. Alpha King Adrian Blackthorn had come himself. She carefully stood and called upward. "Down here." Her voice disappeared into the vast canyon. She tried again with all the strength she could gather. "He is here." This time one of the royal guards leaned over the cliff edge and pointed downward. "Your Majesty," the guard shouted. "Someone is below." Several faces appeared above, their expressions shifting from determination to complete disbelief. None of them expected to find a lone young Omega standing beside the legendary guardian they had searched for across the mountains. Ropes were quickly lowered toward the narrow ledge. Emily stepped aside so the rescuers would have room to descend, but before anyone reached them, the great wolf slowly rose to its feet. The movement was careful yet graceful. The fresh bandages remained secure around its injured foreleg. It tested its weight for only a moment before standing tall once again. A quiet gasp echoed from the men above. One guard whispered, "Impossible." Another answered just as softly, "He is standing." Moments later, a tall figure descended the rope with practiced confidence despite the icy cliff. His long black winter cloak moved with the wind while silver markings embroidered across the fabric caught the pale morning light. Even before his boots reached the frozen ledge, the mountain itself seemed quieter in his presence. Emily immediately recognized him from the royal crest she had seen only in paintings. Alpha King Adrian Blackthorn stepped onto the narrow shelf and looked first toward the great wolf. Relief softened the controlled expression on his face for the briefest instant. Then his attention shifted to the young woman standing quietly beside his oldest companion. He noticed the rope tied around her waist, the weathered satchel filled with herbs, the fresh bandages wrapped carefully around the great wolf's leg, and finally the creature itself leaning gently toward her instead of away from her. The king remained silent for several long seconds. Behind him, the royal guards reached the ledge one by one, only to stop in astonishment. They all knew the great wolf accepted no one's touch except the king's. Yet before their own eyes, the ancient guardian lowered its great head until it rested lightly against Emily's shoulder once again. No command had been given. No fear remained. Only complete trust. Adrian's silver eyes met Emily's, and for the first time since entering the ravine, the legendary Alpha King looked genuinely surprised. The silence that followed seemed to stretch across the entire ravine. None of the royal guards reached for their weapons. None of them spoke. They simply stared at the impossible sight before them. The great wolf, whose loyalty belonged only to the crown, remained standing beside an ordinary young Omega as though protecting her instead of waiting to be protected. Emily lowered her eyes respectfully. She had never stood before a king before, and the quiet authority surrounding Adrian Blackthorn made the frozen air itself feel heavier. Still, she found no cruelty in his expression, only careful observation. His silver eyes moved from the herbs scattered across the ice to the carefully tied bandages around the great wolf's foreleg. "You treated him," Adrian said at last. His voice was calm, carrying neither disbelief nor accusation. Emily gave a small nod. "He was trapped beneath the ice. I only did what anyone should do." A faint exchange of puzzled glances passed between the guards. One of the older captains quietly murmured, "Your Majesty, no one else was willing to climb into Black Hollow." Adrian remained focused on Emily. "What is your name?" "Emily Carter, Your Majesty." "From Frostvale Pack?" She looked up with surprise. "Yes." Adrian nodded almost to himself. "You came here alone." It was not a question. Emily hesitated before answering honestly. "I believed someone needed help." Another guard frowned in confusion. "How could you possibly know where he was?" "We searched every northern trail." Emily searched for an explanation but found none that sounded reasonable. I felt him." The words escaped before she could stop them. Several guards exchanged uncertain expressions. One looked ready to dismiss the answer, but before anyone could speak, the great wolf slowly walked toward Adrian. The king placed one hand gently against the great white neck, relief visible in the quiet smile that briefly softened his face. "Old friend," he whispered. The great wolf answered with another peaceful rumble before doing something that caused every witness to fall silent again. It stepped back toward Emily and lightly touched its broad head against her shoulder once more. Adrian watched the gesture without moving. "He has never done that," one captain whispered. "Not once." Adrian's gaze remained fixed on the ancient guardian. "No," he answered softly. "He has not." The great wolf then lifted its head toward the pale winter sky. A long, powerful howl rolled through the mountains, no longer filled with exhaustion but with quiet strength. The sound echoed from one icy cliff to another until the entire valley seemed to answer. Snow resting high above drifted gently from the trees, sparkling beneath the morning light. For one brief moment, the storm that had hidden the mountains all day began to clear. Sunlight slipped through the heavy clouds and illuminated the narrow ledge where Emily stood. The silver crest embroidered on Adrian's cloak reflected the same soft light, but so did something else. The simple leather bracelet around Emily's wrist, one her grandmother had given her as a child, began to shimmer with a faint silver glow. Emily stared at it in surprise. She had worn it every day for years. It had never changed before. Adrian noticed it immediately. His expression shifted, not with fear, but with unmistakable recognition. "Where did you receive that bracelet?" he asked quietly. Emily looked down at the worn leather band. "My grandmother gave it to me before she disappeared. She told me never to take it off." Adrian stepped one pace closer, studying the faded symbol pressed into the weathered clasp. It was almost invisible beneath years of wear, yet he recognized it instantly. He had seen the same ancient mark only in the oldest records kept beneath the royal palace. A forgotten emblem that belonged to a family believed to have vanished generations earlier. He slowly lifted his eyes to meet Emily's once again. "Miss Carter," he said with calm certainty, "I do not believe your journey to this mountain was an accident. I believe someone has been waiting for you for a very long time." The journey back from Black Hollow Ravine took most of the afternoon. The royal guards insisted that Emily ride one of the reserve horses while the great wolf walked at its own steady pace beside Alpha King Adrian Blackthorn. Every few minutes the magnificent guardian glanced toward Emily, as though quietly making certain she remained close. None of the soldiers failed to notice. Whispered conversations traveled through the line of riders, each trying to understand what they had witnessed upon the frozen ledge. No explanation seemed large enough for the impossible trust that had formed between the ancient guardian and a quiet Omega from Frostvale. Emily kept replaying the king's words in her mind. "Someone has been waiting for you for a very long time." She wanted to ask what he meant, yet every answer seemed hidden somewhere beyond memories she did not possess. By the time they reached Frostvale, the entire village had gathered near the entrance gate. News of the king's arrival had spread faster than the winter wind. Hunters stood shoulder to shoulder beside merchants, elders, and children wrapped in thick coats. Emily immediately recognized many of the familiar faces that had watched her leave only the day before, never imagining she would return alongside the ruler of the Northern Kingdom. A quiet murmur rippled through the crowd as the great wolf entered the village. Then every voice fell silent when the legendary creature walked past dozens of armed warriors and calmly stopped beside Emily once again. Even the little children sensed they were witnessing something extraordinary. Elder Marcus stepped forward and lowered his head respectfully before the king. "Your Majesty," he said. Adrian acknowledged the greeting before looking across the gathered villagers. His expression remained composed, but his voice carried clearly through the snow-covered square. "Which of you searched Black Hollow Ravine?" No one answered. Several hunters lowered their eyes. They had prepared to leave but never crossed the ridge after learning how dangerous the storm had become. Adrian continued without judgment. "Which of you climbed into the ravine?" Silence answered again. Finally the king turned toward Emily. One person did. Every eye followed his gaze. The same young woman many had quietly dismissed as too gentle now stood wrapped in a simple winter cloak with dried herbs still hanging from her satchel. One of the young alphas who had laughed at her that morning looked away in visible embarrassment. Adrian stepped beside Emily before speaking again. "When my oldest companion was trapped beyond hope, trained warriors could not reach him before the storm." He rested one hand against the great wolf's shoulder. This young woman did. The square remained completely silent. She asked for no reward. She carried no weapon. She expected no recognition. Adrian's silver eyes slowly moved across the faces of Frostvale. She saw a life in need, and she answered with courage instead of fear. Emily wished she could disappear beneath the attention now focused entirely upon her. She had never wanted praise. She had only wanted the great wolf to survive. Clara smiled quietly from the edge of the crowd, tears shining in her eyes. Elder Marcus bowed his head more deeply than before. "Emily," he said softly, "we judged your gifts by the wrong measure." The words settled over the village with surprising weight. 4 years' strength had been counted by claws, speed, and victory. Yet standing before them was proof that another kind of strength existed, one that asked for nothing in return. As though understanding every unspoken thought, the great wolf slowly walked forward until it stood directly before Emily. Then, before the entire village and every royal guard present, the ancient guardian lowered its massive head in a gesture of quiet respect. A collective gasp spread through the crowd. Adrian watched the moment without surprise. Deep inside, he already knew this was not simply gratitude. It was recognition. Whatever ancient secret had awakened upon the frozen mountain had only begun to reveal itself, and for the first time in generations, destiny had found the person it had been patiently waiting to meet. The village remained silent long after the great wolf lowered its head before Emily. No celebration erupted. No one hurried to fill the quiet with words. Some moments were too meaningful to disturb, and this was one of them. Snow drifted gently across Frostvale, settling on rooftops, evergreen branches, and the broad white back of the ancient guardian, whose calm silver eyes never strayed far from the young Omega who had crossed a frozen abyss expecting nothing in return. Emily stood motionless, her cheeks warmed by embarrassment rather than pride. She had never imagined herself standing at the center of anyone's attention. For most of her life she had been overlooked, not because people hated her, but because they believed gentleness could never change the world. Yet everything around her now quietly challenged that belief. Alpha King Adrian Blackthorn stepped closer until he stood beside her. His voice remained steady, carrying across the square without ever becoming harsh. A kingdom is not protected by strength alone. It endures because someone chooses compassion when fear would be easier. His words settled into the hearts of everyone listening. Many lowered their eyes, remembering how quickly they had dismissed the quiet Omega, who spent her days caring for injured creatures while others sought glory. Adrian then carefully removed the heavy silver clasp from his winter cloak. The emblem bore the crest of the Northern Kingdom, a symbol recognized by every pack across the land. Instead of returning it to his shoulder, he gently placed it into Emily's hands. "This is not a reward," he said. "It is a promise. Wherever this crest is recognized, you will always have the protection of the crown." Emily looked up in surprise. "Your Majesty, I only did what felt right." Adrian offered the faintest smile. "That is exactly why you deserve it." The great wolf stepped beside them and released a deep, peaceful rumble that echoed softly through the valley. Even the restless winter wind seemed to grow still once more. High above the village, the clouds slowly parted, allowing warm afternoon sunlight to spill across the snow. The faded leather bracelet around Emily's wrist shimmered once again, brighter than before, and although no one fully understood its meaning, every person present sensed they had witnessed the beginning of something far older than memory. Weeks passed and life in Frostvale gradually returned to its familiar rhythm, yet nothing truly remained the same. Children often visited Emily's small shelter, no longer out of curiosity but to help care for injured animals. Hunters who once laughed at her now greeted her with quiet respect. Elder Marcus asked for her advice whenever wounded creatures were found near the village, understanding that her gift reached places ordinary skill could not. Sometimes, just before sunrise, travelers crossing the northern roads reported seeing the great wolf standing silently at the edge of the forest, watching over Frostvale before disappearing into the mountains again. Emily never spoke of those mornings, but whenever she found enormous paw prints outside her little shelter, she smiled. Far away within the royal palace, forgotten records were carefully opened for the first time in generations. Adrian searched through ancient journals describing a family whose rare gift had once healed not only wounded wolves but wounded hearts, a lineage history believed had vanished beneath the snow long ago. Each page brought him closer to one undeniable truth. Destiny had not chosen Emily because she was powerful. It had chosen her because kindness had remained her first instinct even when no one was watching. And perhaps that had always been the rarest strength of all. In a world that admired the loudest voices and the strongest warriors, one quiet Omega reminded an entire kingdom that true greatness is measured not by the power someone holds, but by the hope they are willing to give away, even when they believe no one will ever remember their name.